Thank you. Welcome to another public lecture of the 21st Century China Center. As all of you know, 21st Century China Center is located in the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UCSD. GPS is home to a number of master's degrees for policy and international affairs, including a master's in Chinese economic and political affairs master's degree, and some of the attendees here are in that program. It's a specialized program on China studies. As many of you know, I'm Victor Shi, Director of the 21st Century China Center and Ho Chair Professor of China and Pacific Relations. Today, we're very honored to welcome my mentor and Professor Yasheng Huang from MIT, who's going to come and talk to us about his new book, The Rise and Fall of the East, How Exams, Autocracy, Stability, and Technology Brought China Success and Why They Might Lead to Its Decline. A very quick bio on Yasheng, even though many of you know him very well already. He is currently the Epoch Foundation Professor of Global Economics and Management at MIT Sloan School of Management. From 2013 to 2017, Yasheng served as an Associate Dean in charge of MIT Sloan's Global Partnership Program and Action Learning Initiatives. He is author of 11 books, but including, I would say, some classics that everyone should read, including the latest book. But I am, of course, a huge fan of his first book, the Investment Control book, as well as Capitalism of Chinese Characteristics. In fact, today I just recommended one of my PhD students to read it just today. And then there's a new book. Outside of academic research, Yasheng has written for New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times. He's worked on several policy projects related to US-China relations, especially an MIT, I would say a path-breaking MIT report entitled University Engagement with China and MIT Approach. It is one of the first report, if not the first report of its kind, and really points the direction to how academic institutions in the United States need to engage with China in a fruitful way that still protects our national security, of course. Please join me in welcoming Yasheng.
Thank you, Victor, for the introduction and for the invitation to talk about my book. I just want to emphasize that how great this university is, UCSD is, in terms of creating the center and the GPS as a school that have top academics on China, on Asia, and really congratulate Victor, Harry, Susan, and Lei, for creating such a great place, not just for faculty here, but the faculty who are interested in China to work on China worldwide. So I was paid to say that. Anyway, so let's move on to a smaller thing, which is the book I published last year by Yale University Press. And actually, one of the first talks that I gave on the ideas of the book was the talk sponsored by your center. I think Barry.
January 2021.
January 2021 on Zoom. So at that time, I was finishing the book. Now it has come out from last year, September 2023. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to finish my presentation in 20 minutes. And I really look forward to conversations and dialogues with Victor and as well as with people in the room. So I'll speed up my presentation. Sorry about that. That's the last So I mistook the last page for the second slide. So I should, which is the first page. Yeah, that's the first page. So, so scholars and authors draw inspiration from somewhere, and I also drew my own inspiration. And I drew my inspiration from Autocracy. So, so for me, it is Autocracy, so I dedicate a whole book to them. I dedicate it to the other parts of the world. So there's not so much to write about. There have done bad things in other arenas, but for me, they serve as a permanent source of inspiration. So this is the table of contents of the book. And the four letters in the title of the book, East, it is geography, East, but it stands for examination. So that's letter E, and then autocracy, stability, and technology. So part one is exam, part two is autocracy, part three is stability, and part four is more speculative about, part four is the technology. Part five is more speculative about the future of this East model. So it has very broad coverage, as you can see. And then the book alternates between history and today. It's organized by topics rather than by chronology. And the exam, autocracy, stability, and technology, and how these four dynamics have shaped China's past and its current development. It's descriptive, analytical, and to some extent prescriptive. So toward the end, I try to be prescriptive. I want to draw from Chinese own experience, Chinese own history, rather than theories and values. So this is not a book about preaching any particular values and any particular school of thought. My hope is, because I'm just drawing on the Chinese history, then we can have a more rational and calm discussions about the prescriptive part of the book. And I don't really do much cross-country comparison. So there are many topics that I discussed in the book. Why Imperial China was so stable, why it was stagnant, declined, and why reformist CCP, Chinese Communist Party, which I defined from 78 to 2018, could deliver both growth and stability. So that combination was extremely rare in the Chinese history. At one point in history, they could have growth, they could have technology, but then they didn't have stability. And then they could deliver stability without growth. It was one of the rare moments in Chinese history that they could do both during those years. And so my book goes into the mechanisms behind that. And how the political system kind of went back to a more autocratic nature since 1989, and sometimes quite frontally and quite overtly, sometimes not so obviously. I also talk about succession uncertainties. That topic used to be quite occupying the attentions of Chinese scholars. It went away because succession issues were thought to be resolved, but I believe that it's going to come back. And then I also speculated about this counterfactual history. There was a very, to me, a very important institution in the Chinese political system, the Central Advisory Commission, and why the demise of that institution mattered for Chinese politics. But that was purely counterfactual. I also discussed GDP targeting, why GDP targeting was important. And the importance of GDP targeting, obviously it's important for GDP, but it's also important in the following sense, which is that when the government is focusing on GDP, it is focusing less on other things, right? And those other things are power struggles, ideological conflicts, and personality cult, right? So GDP targeting is good, not just because it's good for GDP growth, but it's also good because it takes away the attention of the political elites from these purely destructive activities such as class struggles and power struggles. So today I'm just going to focus on T, on technology, because it's too broad and it's going to take too much time. And also I wanted to go and buy the book, so I don't want to give up everything. So I'm going to reflect on the historical technological development rather quickly. And then I'm going to draw lessons from Chinese historical record of technology. So let me just say briefly the patterns of history, at least in technology. China, I think many people in this room will know, once led the world in science and technology in history. China invented the big fours. These are, belonging to the most impactful inventions in human history: gunpowder, paper making, compass, and printing. Francis Bacon, he actually didn't know that Chinese invented these 4 big inventions, but he had a keen appreciation for their impact. These inventions altered the face and the state of the world, first in literacy matters, secondly in warfare, third in navigation. Karl Marx made a similar comment, and he focused on the social and revolutionary transformation as a result of these 4 big inventions. But one thing that we don't have sufficient appreciation for is that Chinese historical inventiveness went way beyond these big 4s. So when we talk about Chinese inventions, usually people think about the big 4s, but in fact, Chinese inventiveness went way beyond these 4. So this is just a list of inventions that go beyond the big 4. And one column gives the Chinese, the dates when Chinese invented these technologies, and the other gave the dates of European inventions. And almost across the board, Chinese were about 1,000 years ahead in these technological inventions. So this is a familiar story. On the right side, on the left side of the screen is the fleet commanded by Zheng He, right? 7 voyages by Zheng He, and the other is the Christopher Columbus fleet that discovered America. Zheng He had something like 20,000 sailors, and Christopher Columbus had maybe 70 or 80 people. So there was no comparison, and they took place roughly around the same time. The Zheng He's voyages happened about 70 years, 60 years earlier. So roughly in the same time span. And Chinese navigational technology was way ahead of the European navigational technology. But then the Chinese technology collapsed. And so the question has been, why did the East fall? So one speculation, and Ian Morris provided that speculation very, very clearly, is that did China miss the opportunity for industrial revolution? So did China miss the boat by a very small merging of era. And he argued China did. And he sort of blamed the whole fiasco on the Ming emperors. He called them idiots, right? Emperor idiots. They made wrong decisions because they banned the voyages. Not only they banned their voyages, they actually burned the historical records and the construction manual. And then they issued the edict that prohibited another voyage. And that edict was in effect for 400 years. So he essentially blamed the entire fall of Chinese technology on that one decision. And he argued that the world could have been very, very different. It could have been a Confucianist world order. It didn't have to be a Western world order, right? So the basic idea is that China missed the boat just by a little bit. So I'm going to contest that idea. And the critical thing for people like Ian Morris to make that argument is that it's the view that Chinese technology was more or less comparable and even ahead of Western technology as late as 17th century and 18th century. So the dating is very, very important. And then China fell behind. Right? So what we are able to show is that Chinese decline happened much earlier, almost 1,000 years earlier. So China, the fall of Chinese technology happened long before Industrial Revolution. So China missed the boat, but not by the kind of narrow margin that people like Ian Morris believe. So later on, I'm going to talk about data, but let me just say that our findings are based on the data set that we constructed. And here are the highlights of the findings. So China was most inventive when there was political competition. When the political and territorial units were small, that is kingdoms rather than empires. When China had ideological diversity, that is to say there were multiple ideologies vying for attentions and for intellectual appeal. And then Chinese inventiveness declined when China became a unified empire. When there was rising political stability, when multiple ideologies were demolished into one single ideology, Confucianism. So in my book, I argue that the Keju system, the exam system, played a very important role in this development. I'll be happy to go into question and answer about that, but I'm not going to elaborate on that. So the critical pivot is 6th century, when China introduced the Keju system. And in our data, we immediately see a first decline of Chinese technology in 6th century. So this is where we differ from basically a consensus among historians that Chinese decline happened much later, maybe 16th century, maybe 17th century, including the person who created the entire field of Chinese history of science, Joseph Needham. He believed that Chinese decline happened in 17th century. So this is our kind of summary data. So the first bar, that was the height of Chinese inventiveness. And that was essentially between the 5th century BCE and 6th century CE. So that was the peak. And then there's a first decline, substantial decline. That was roughly from 6th century to 13th century. And then there was another decline after 13th century. So if you look at the raw data, they are not as smooth. So this is summary data. But the basic pattern is very, very clear. the earlier dynasties before 6th century were much more inventive as compared with the later dynasties. And our measure of inventiveness is number of inventions divided by population, 1 million people as the unit per dynasty. And then we do lots of adjustments, no matter whether you control for the length of the dynasty, whether you use the urban population, whether you use different estimates of the population, they gave you exactly the same result, which is that the first decline happened as early as 6th century. So one criticism, consistent criticism of this way of constructing our data is to say that you weight all the technologies the same way, right? Gunpowder. So I don't know if people know that Chinese also invented umbrella, right? And then there's at least one theory that says that Chinese invented brandy. When I reported that result, at Cambridge University, I didn't make new friends. Yeah, so essentially our measure equates gunpowder, compass, and printing and paper making the same way as brandy and umbrella. That's true, right? So you could make the argument that later dynasties may not be that inventive in terms of quantity, but maybe they are more inventive in terms of quality. They invent more important things. Song dynasty is a very good example. So Song will fall within our first period of decline. It was less inventive as compared with the previous period. But Song invented 3 out of the 4 big fours, right? Gunpowder, compass, and printing. Han Dynasty invented paper, right? So arguably you could say, okay, Song may not be that impressive in terms of the number of inventions, but they're more impressive in terms of the quality. So what we did was we made adjustments to the quality. What we did was that we collected information from historians who reported on the most important inventions in Chinese history. And then we assigned them these most important inventions greater weights, right? We gave them a weight of 50, we gave them a weight of 20, we gave them a weight of 10, and 2 and 5. And then we compare these weighted measure with the unweighted measure. They gave you exactly the same curves. So essentially, this is sort of before 6th century, that's the peak, right? The yellow line represents the measure that has 50, we gave them a weight of 50. They gave you exactly the same trend. So that's a legitimate criticism, but that criticism doesn't really fundamentally change our finding. So let me say a little bit about our database. It's Chinese historical inventions data set. We go to Joseph Needham's Science and Civilization of China. He and his students and colleagues compiled 27 volumes on Chinese science. It's just a remarkable piece of work. And then Chinese Academy of Sciences compiled their own volumes on the history of Chinese science and technology. So these are our two source materials. And we collaborated with Professor Wei Hong from Tsinghua University. The challenge there is that the Joseph Needham and Chinese Academy of Sciences, they didn't list these inventions by tables. So they just wrote about them in a text. So essentially, these are free-form texts. So what we did was we had, for each volume, we had 2 research assistants read the whole volume and then extracted information on inventions independently from independently from these volumes to make sure that they don't make any mistakes. So altogether, we have some 44 researchers at Tsinghua University, and then back at MIT, we have 10 researchers essentially cleaning up the data, matching the inventions with the dynasties, and then also we come up with a number of algorithms to deal with missing data, missing information. So the whole thing took about 6 years. A lot of it was manual labor, and this was before ChatGPT and more recent language models, and so all of that was manual labor. We were able to identify about 15,000 inventions in these two source materials, but then we were able to match about 10,000 of them with dynasties. About 7,000 of them we can match directly. The rest we have to sort of come up with algorithms to match them to different dynasties. So that's kind of our data construction procedure. And I'll be happy to, usually at an academic seminar, I will spend about 50% of the time talking about the data, but let me move on. So the fundamental claim that I made in my book, and by the way, Wei Hong and some other Chinese academics were writing a whole book about the Needham question. It's forthcoming from Princeton University Press. So in my book, I argued that Keju system produced a huge impact on the pattern that I just demonstrated. What Keju did was a homogenized Chinese political space, homogenized Chinese ideological space. And that homogeneity was detrimental to creativity, to inventiveness, and to debates, to technological development. And the other thing that the other claim that I made is that the Keju system itself didn't unify China politically. It was really a result of the reunification by the Sui dynasty that led to the Keju system. But what Keju system did was that it kept China unified, right? So if you look at the Chinese history before Sui dynasty and Chinese history after Sui dynasty, the period in which Chinese history was in the state of disunity relative to the state of unity, the ratio is about 3 to 7. So 30% of the time was unified, 70% of the time was disunified. After the Sui dynasty, the ratio switched. 30% of the time disunified, and 70% of the time unified. So the Keju exam didn't create reunification of China, but it kept Chinese unity permanent. So this is the stability idea that I discuss in my book. So Keju was a critical anchoring institution in my book. Keju is a fascinating system, fascinating sort of human capital selection process. It was extremely systematic. It was extremely well designed by historical standard. Right? It had all sorts of mechanisms to prevent cheating and plagiarism. It was efficient and powerful. And it was also nationwide. Right? What it did was it scaled Chinese state and consolidated political unity. And that began to happen in the 6th century. And then beginning in 12th century, 13th century, it began to unify the Chinese ideology, because the only ideology that was tested on the Keju exam was the new Confucianism. So essentially, the new Confucianism crowded out everything else: Buddhism, Taoism, Moism, and liberalism. So that was good for the stability. That was good for the unitarianness of the country. It was extremely bad for economic development, for technological development. And I use that argument to explain the rise of technology in China when China was more diverse politically and ideologically, and then the decline when China began to move into this permanent, stable equilibrium. So let me quickly draw lessons from history. So in my book, I was explicit. This is not a book about laissez-faire economics. This is not a book touting the value of competition. In our forthcoming book, we actually emphasize the role of the government as being extremely important for the early success of Chinese technology. It was not intentional industrial policy. It was not intentional technological agenda. What happened was that for whatever reasons, the Chinese dynasties value human capital. So they put a lot of smart people on the government payroll. Some of them became inventors. Others were writers and poets. So even a lot of poets in ancient China were on the government payroll. So the support by the government was in the form of government employment. So I'm not going to deny government support, as an important factor. Made in China 2025, all sorts of initiatives in China supporting technology. I'm not going to say those things are not important. What I'm going to say is that you need that as well as openness. You also need diversity. You also need collaborations. You also need a competitive environment for that government support to be able to lead to inventions. And China, during the reform period, had massive investments in R&D. China is the only developing country that is spending about 2% of the GDP on R&D. So China definitely has the scale. But China also figured out how to use that scale advantage to also open the economy, open the research institutions to Western institutions, to Western companies. So essentially, by globalization of research, globalization of education, supported very often by Chinese money, you are combining this advantage of scale with the advantage of openness and diversity, what I call scope in my book. So let's go down the list, right? International collaborations and exchanges. By the way, in doing the research for this book, I was surprised to find out that China began to open its educational institutions and human capital collaborations with the United States ahead of the diplomatic relationship with China, ahead of the passage of foreign investment laws, ahead of special economic zones, right? So China, Deng Xiaoping especially, always prioritized human capital collaboration with the West. So there was a Western trained human capital, and then China also opened up financial sector to foreign risk capital, right? If you go down the list, Alibaba, Baidu, Tencent, each one of them was backed by a foreign venture capital company. FDI, VCP played a very, very important role in funding the early technological startups. The role of Hong Kong, I'll be happy to go into that. And also China introduced during this period, social flexibilities and rising tolerance. So let me emphasize the last bullet point. We know that China doesn't have academic freedom, for sure now. But even before Xi Jinping, it didn't have academic freedom, it didn't have rule of law, it didn't have free speech. The way that I think about this issue is that when you have globalization of human capital, when you have research collaborations with Western research institutions, you are essentially outsourcing that academic freedom into your research environment. Right? When a Tsinghua University professor goes to Stanford, goes to UCSD, he or she enjoys the same academic freedom as you and I do at Stanford, at UCSD. Hong Kong provided a very important role in terms of providing rule of law functions and business knowledge. And that's why many of the Chinese high-tech startups register their capital base in Hong Kong rather than in China. Right? So it doesn't really violate the fundamental kind of regularity that we observe in other countries, which is that you need some basic rule of law, you need some basic diversity of ideas and tolerance of freedom of speech in order for inventiveness to flourish. It's just that the difference is that China itself didn't provide those on its territory, but it has this massive effort to outsource that from outside of China. So Huawei, many people in this country think about Huawei as an industrial policy success. I'm not going to deny the importance of industrial policy, but Huawei was one of the most collaborative Chinese companies. The camera was jointly developed with a German company. They worked with US companies on multiple product developments. When I went there in 2018, the person who hosted me, the chief strategist of Huawei, is a British citizen. So it is actually, at first achieved success, actually not within China. It first achieved success in Africa, in Europe, in Russia, in a very competitive market. Industrial policy happened actually much later, after Huawei had already established a record of success. But since 2018, so that's why I draw the curtain on that year, while China still retains its scale, like industrial policy, R&D spending, many of the diversity conditions created during the Deng Xiaoping era have been systematically and substantially undermined. Crackdown on social media, ascendancy of national security imperatives, undermining the autonomy of Hong Kong, and then crackdowns on high-profile, high-tech businesses and entrepreneurs, and proactive or reactive deglobalization, kind of going alone, self-reliance, going back to the Mao era. I'm not saying we are already in the Mao era, it's just directionally it's moving in that area. So then I pose this question to all of us. What are the implications for China's future economic and technological prospects when you only have the scale left without the scope condition? I'm just going to lay out my own view. I'm not going to be very optimistic about that scenario. But maybe people have a different point of view. Thank you very much.
Great. Very awesome book. I urge all of you to go out and buy it. I'll just get the discussion going with a couple of questions. One easy, one hard. I think, well, the easy one could be hard also. I don't know. Well, to me, your finding is very striking that with the introduction of the exam system alone, the number of innovation dropped so dramatically. But to me, that also speaks to some kind of market failure at that time, which is, of course, that was much of the world. But what was the market like for, technology that was innovative, right? So today, I think one of the biggest innovations that some people say about the modern contemporary global economy is that it's very efficient in translating technology into a product that you can turn into cash. Was there a market mechanism like that back in China at that time? And why? Because, if there was such market, the exam system alone would not have caused this dramatic change, right?
So let me be very clear. So the first drop was not mainly driven by the exam system. The first drop was driven by the fact that China moved from a multi-political world of it's called the 魏晋南北 period, and that was from 220 CE to 580 CE. So if you counted the number of political units at the maximum time, we counted about 39 units. And then some of the units changed hands very, very quickly. So there was a lot of turnover. There was a lot of change. So the first drop was principally because of that. And then what the Ke system did was a homogenized ideology, and that system worked slowly in the historical times. It took about 3 centuries, 4 centuries to complete that process, and that led to the second fall. So let me just get through the core of your question. No, there was no market mechanism. The definition of industrial revolution is the definition of industrial revolution is that inventiveness went up, but it was more importantly about deployment. Right? So the steam engines is used for economic development, for commercial development, and then you have patents, you have these things. Yeah, so the Chinese inventions and the Western inventions until 17th century were all idiosyncratic. Some of them were kind of almost like contracted with the government, seismographs, for example. But most of them were essentially people coming out with their own ideas with really no, at least, large scale applications. Otherwise, industrial revolution would have happened in China first, right? So your instinct is exactly right. It was, the invention was politically dependent and ideologically reliant. Once those two conditions disappeared, then you also have a decline of inventiveness.
So it's like, even if there was still a lot of inventions, it would not have led to the industrial revolution because there was not the modern corporation and property rights and legal system, et cetera, or
well,
so do you think it still would have made a pretty big difference if the inventions would have happened?
I think the industrial revolution requires at least two things. One is there were quite a few inventions going on,
right?
And the other was this institutional evolution that somehow motivated inventors to convert their inventions into product development, into commercialization. By 17th century, so we all know on the institutional side, nothing remotely comparable to the West happened in China. But by 17th century, Chinese inventions were declining to almost an unobservable level, right? So you're missing both of these conditions, and these are probably not even sufficient conditions, they're necessary conditions. China was missing both of them.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense for the 17th century and after, because like even if Southern China, some places began to adopt some of these Western corporate structures, there were the intellectual elite was so homogenized by that point that they could not have done things. Now I asked a harder question. I'm just kidding. I don't know if the first one was harder, this one will be. So you make this point, which I completely agree with, which is that there's outsourcing of creativity from China. Some would say free riding. I would say it's kind of like knowledge diffusion is just so much more efficient around the world now. And also the global economy is so much more efficient than 500 years ago, such that if you produce a product that is just as good or nearly just as good as the competitor, but it's a lot cheaper, you can sell it.
Like the EVs.
Most likely, EVs or whatever, you can sell it. isn't that enough for the future growth trajectory of China? It's like, you could be right that, new inventions are not happening in China, but they can very quickly adopt whatever is invented elsewhere. What China is very good at is this mixture of Russian and East Asian manufacturing base, right? Which can very quickly reduce the cost of things that are being invented and sell it to the ready global market. That's pretty good.
Yeah. So let me be careful about what I'm saying. China can grow without technology. So it's not a statement about economic growth. If they have the right policies, if they have the right institutions, at least they can grow with endogenous technology. So the growth itself would create technologies and fund technological development. So I'm not. Under Xi Jinping, I'm worried about growth. And the technology. I was specifically talking about technological invention, right? So in my book, I talk about the scientific papers and, one thing tomorrow we have this seminar on US-China science, and I'm very curious to know what is the level of scientific collaborations between China and US today? Mm-hmm. I don't know the number, but my guess is that it is a very low number. And at MIT, I don't know a single project. And so, so we're talking about decoupling, how difficult it is to decouple from China. But scientific collaborations are different. Scientific collaborations, these are discrete decisions that you make, right? And the scientists don't really have any institutional mandate to collaborate with China. When you put up so many things that stand in the way of collaborations, they will just collaborate with German scientists, with British scientists. So my guess is that the decoupling is already happening in the scientific arena. So my prediction is that to the extent that the Chinese successes before, and we have statistical evidence to show that high impact papers were written jointly between Chinese scientists and Western scientists, to the extent that collaborations decline substantially, my prediction is that the Chinese scientific achievements will be affected negatively, right? So whether or not that prevents BYD, that's a separate issue. So, but that's really more about scaling, right? So you have this incredible capacity to scale quickly from technology to product. And that's something that US is not very good at. We're trying to catch up with China. Maybe we'll get there, maybe we won't get there. But that's a different book. That's a different thing.
Yeah. Great. Thanks. We'll open it up to questions. Yeah, Carl, real historian, please.
First of all, thank you very much for the very stimulating presentation, as well as all of your work. Like Victor, I frequently cite and refer others to read your work. I'm kind of wondering how your arguments changed over the course of your research. You constructed a massive database that no historian, I don't think conventional historian could ever create. And I'm kind of wondering how you guarded against the tendency to perhaps construct a database that proved what you kind of set out to show in the first place. So I guess one way of my seeing that you didn't do that is to see whether there were dramatic changes in some of your arguments based on the data as it came in.
Yeah, so let me just be very clear. When we constructed the data, we had no strong priors one way or the other. Definitely not about the date, about the timing of the decline. Sui dynasty, I had no idea what Sui dynasty was, by the way. And I didn't really, many China historians don't really pay much attention to that dynasty. If you read Fairbank, the classic textbook by Fairbank, he devoted a page and a half to the Sui dynasty. If you read Qian Mu's book on Chinese history, he mentioned Grand Canal, and that's about it, right? So it is not a dynasty that jumped out automatically, even to the historians, let alone to a layman like myself, right? And so I only began to be interested in the dynasty after I did some work with Claire Young on the Koji system. And then I found out, okay, so the Koji was invented. I mean, this is showing to a professional historian how ignorant I am. I didn't know that it was invented by the Sui dynasty. I really had no knowledge, let alone, 6 years before we began to construct the data set to forecast that the decline was going to happen around 6th century. Really, I mean, I think what I had a little bit of priors about Qing dynasty. I went along with the historians' verdict that Chinese technology began to decline in 17th century. So I took that as my starting point. So if I had any prior, the prior was I knew Qing dynasty to be very repressive, right? I knew it was very inward-looking and all of that. So I thought what I would do is to use data to prove historians correct. Their timing is correct, 17th century, but now I have data to show, yes, it happened in 17th century. I had no idea it will come out this way. And the 44 poor researchers at Tsinghua University never received an instruction from us or pay attention to Sui dynasty. So I hardly knew anything about Sui dynasty. So I really feel innocent on that. I think it's quite legitimate to criticize the results, the findings on data. One criticism is, are you using a consistent definition of inventions, technologies? What about record keeping? There could be differences in terms of how they kept records. I think I'm willing to go into that. But I'm going to defend myself. I didn't have priors about Sui dynasty.
Online. One of the questions we have from, you just mentioned definitions of invention. We have a question from online. How did you define inventions? Because it might seem like one invention might be worth 1,000 times more than some other inventions. You did 50 times, but
Oh,
right?
Okay. So we can do.
Yeah.
It's actually when you do 50 times, as opposed to 10 times, they accentuate the period before Koji. So the gap between the figure weighted 50 times as compared with the data weighted by 1 is actually much bigger as compared with the others during that period of time, during the most, whereas in other periods they were similar, right? So in fact, many of the most important inventions happened before Koji, during the 2nd century, 3rd century, 6th century. In terms of definition, we don't really have any unique power to define technology. We just use whatever Joseph Needham used and whatever the Chinese Academy of Sciences used. We have no independent capability to say, oh, this is technology, that is not technology. What they define as, so let me just say that I use technology in a very loose way. I really want to stress we are looking at inventions. So what are the inventions? And they can be a new discovery, right, of a astronomical phenomenon. It can be a new gadget. It can be a new method. It can be a product, right? So we use whatever. So truly, this is building on the shoulders of the giants. When I was applying for a grant, one of the reviewers asked me to verify the information that Joseph Needham collected. And then I gave them the list. Each of the 27 volumes that Joseph Needham compiled had 80 to 90 pages of bibliography. I couldn't possibly verify his sources. For one thing, I don't know classical Chinese, and Joseph Needham did, right? So, and then I said, if you give me another 150 years, I could do it. So we kind of, at some point when you do research, you have to stop somewhere. You have to say, okay, there are certain things that the previous scholars have done, and we accept them as on their face value, and then we move on. We cannot redo it. We cannot recreate the wheel. So that will be mine. So even if their definitions may have some issues, there's no way for us to really devise our own definition, because we're not struggling with the original material.
But Brandy made it onto the list.
Brandy made it to the list, yes. But that was more about Robert Temple rather than my Josephine.
Whatever, yeah.
So when talking about the technological decline, aside from a few instances of, for instance, burning the shipbuilding manuals, it's not that technology went backwards, it's that the rate of progress declined. So that makes me wonder if there could be another factor in that at certain levels of technological advancement, you reach a shelf at which, you know, the breakthrough technologies to progress to new levels of whatever comes next is just more difficult at that time. Is that possible?
It is possible, theoretically speaking, but not in this context, right? So it is true that technically speaking, you don't go backward, but you do in the following sense, right? In the ancient times, there's not a sort of a systematic way to store the knowledge. You actually forget what your ancestors invented. So even though the knowledge, theoretically speaking, is still there, but if you don't know that knowledge, you are essentially going back, right? You are not using that knowledge. So China invented the water clock. And then during the Qing Dynasty, when the Western emissaries went to China, presented a gift of a water clock to the emperor had no idea what that was. He forgot that China actually invented the water clock. China actually forgot many of the things they invented, even though, as Joseph Needham did, they kept the record. But that record, you know, probably was not read, was not taught in schools, because the entire Keju system is about memorizing the Confucian texts. And to pass the Keju exam, even at the basic level, you basically have to memorize between 300,000 and 400,000 characters. Right? So essentially, it taxes your mental capacity to the limit. And you usually don't have time to do mathematics, to do medicine, to do anything else. And also, there's no incentive because there's nothing on the exam that tests you the knowledge of medicine, technology. So, in terms of whether or not it is the later, it is harder, earlier, it is easier. I think I would dispute that, right? So, you know, today, if you go to a middle school, you kind of know the 3 laws of invented by Isaac Newton. But for Newton to invent that, it was incredibly hard, right? So the later people, actually, I would argue, will always have an easier time because they can build their inventions and discovery on the basis of the prior inventions and knowledge, whereas the prior generations had nothing to work with, right? So it's actually become progressively easier in that mechanical sense. And so if you look at the Western inventions, after the 17th century, so before it was moving like this, and then it was going like that, right? Exponential growth, precisely because you are able to combine the knowledge from before with a new knowledge, right? Rather than each time inventing something new. So I don't buy the argument that earlier it was easy, later it is hard. That's why it explains this downward trend. In the West, that's definitely not. In the West, we see this rather than this.
No universities with diverse disciplines, right? It's just everyone just studying the same thing.
Exactly the same thing. It's all memorization, nothing else.
very quickly. They were running low on time.
Do you run the danger of you portray the culture system as something that has continuously remained the same since the Qing dynasty, but it has changed over time?
Yeah.
And also in some dynasty, for example, like a Yuan dynasty, examination system was abolished,
Yeah.
or not adopted for some period, and the people who, I mean, one plausible explanation of the impact of culture system is that it drew the talents away. It
Yeah.
provided for to focus on government service, right? So people are not, if you are talented, if you
Yeah.
brain, you go there. But just like today, civil service exams. So and besides, since 1905 till 2025, we have had 100 years without culture.
Mhm.
I mean, so in the periods of without culture, do you foresee the inventiveness to go up? And also, like the culture system itself has changed over time.
No, so, but let's be very clear on what we are talking about here, right? So today we have Gaokao, the entrance exam, college entrance exam. We have a similar culture system in the West as well, right? In India, in Britain, Germany adopted something similar to culture. There's a fundamental difference between the civil service exam system as one of many channels, right? In the West, you can take an exam and become a State Department, official, right? But you can, go into academia, you can become a professor, you can launch an enterprise, become an entrepreneur, you can do other things, you can launch a political campaign, and then become a politician. Culture is something entirely different. That's the only channel. There's absolutely nothing else, right? So this is the only channel. So that your point about culture kind of crowding out the human capital is absolutely right. You have this very narrow channel that everybody was trying to go through this system, and there was no other alternative competitive channel, such as commerce, such as politics, such as academia, right? So culture, in my book, shouldn't be equated with the civil service exam, even in China or in the West. So it's just like SAT. When we admit students, SAT is one of the things that we look at, but we also look at letters of recommendation and these other things, right? So that's also the difference from the culture system.
That's understood, but over time it has changed, right?
No, it changed only in a narrower direction. So that there's a very well-established consensus among historians that culture at the beginning was more open-ended. It had more subject matters. For example, during the Tang Dynasty, they had medicine tested. They had some other subject matter, music, and other things. And over time, during the Song Dynasty, it began to narrow. By Yuan Dynasty, they stopped the culture, but then they reconstituted culture. Yuan did the most narrow. Yuan adopted the new Confucianism as the culture curriculum. The new Confucianism, invented by Zhu Xi, was the most narrow ideology of all the ideologies. So Yuan contributed enormously to the narrowing of the culture. So Yuan was not a non-actor. Yuan played a central role in the development of culture systems.
It's the Mongolian invasion. Anyway, we're out of time. On May 2nd, our next talk is with Scott Kennedy from the CSIS, who's going to talk about his recent research trip on assessing how Chinese companies are doing in a range of industries in the face of US de-risking strategy. So that's going to be really interesting on May 2nd. Once again, please join me in thank you, Professor Huang.